In 1945, the guns of the Second World War finally went silent. But before the dust had even settled, the world's major military powers were already drawing up the blueprints for the third. Military strategists on both sides assumed a clash was inevitable. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill commissioned a plan to push back Soviet forces in Europe, aptly named Operation Unthinkable. Decades later, the Warsaw Pact drafted 7 days to the River Rhine, a simulation that anticipated millions of casualties in a massive European land war. This diagram illustrates the core doctrine that guided the era, known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The logic was grim but simple. If you launch a nuclear strike, we will launch ours, and both nations are annihilated. But that exact doctrine created a fragile, hyper-reactive system. By preparing for the worst-case scenario, militaries built a machine where a minor conventional skirmish could trigger a guaranteed unstoppable cascade of nuclear retaliation. If those strategic defense systems had functioned exactly as designed, you and I wouldn't be here today. The only reason modern civilization is still standing is that at the critical moment, individual people broke protocol and brought the machine to a halt. By October 1962, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and deep in the Caribbean Sea, the Soviet submarine B-59 was cut off from Moscow, running out of air and hiding from American warships. To force the sub to the surface, the U.S. Navy began dropping depth charges. Inside the sweltering, exhausted submarine, the blast sounded like a full-scale assault. The captain, believing the war had already started, ordered his crew to arm their 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo. Protocol required the consent of 3 senior officers to launch. 2 agreed, but the executive officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. He argued the depth charges were warning shots, not acts of war, and successfully talked the captain down. In the most tense standoff of the 20th century, the systems demanded a nuclear strike. One man's flat refusal to comply kept the torpedo in its tube. As global arsenals grew, human reflexes became too slow to track incoming threats. Militaries handed that responsibility over to early warning computer systems. That reliance introduced immediate vulnerabilities. In November 1979, displays at the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, suddenly indicated a massive Soviet launch. Panic swept through the facility as the U.S. prepared for emergency retaliation, only to realize minutes later that someone had accidentally run a training simulation tape on the live system. 4 years later, a similar flaw appeared on the other side of the Iron Curtain. A Soviet early warning system flashed an alert that American intercontinental ballistic missiles were in the air. The officer on duty was Stanislav Petrov. Petrov's standing orders dictated that he immediately report an incoming strike, which would trigger a massive Soviet counterattack. But he noticed the system only detected 5 missiles. A genuine preemptive strike, he reasoned, would involve hundreds. He logged the alarm as a system malfunction. Later investigations confirmed the radar had been confused by sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds. When the doomsday algorithm generated a false positive, human skepticism stepped in to override it. Even after the Cold War ended, the rigid momentum of military protocol continued to test individual resolve. In June 1999, at the end of the Kosovo War, a contingent of 250 Russian troops unexpectedly occupied Pristina International Airport right ahead of advancing NATO forces. The American NATO Supreme Allied Commander, General Wesley Clark, ordered his troops to assault the airfield and forcefully remove the Russians. But the officer on the ground, British General Mike Jackson, directly defied the command. He explicitly told Clark, "I'm not going to start the Third World War for you," and instead ordered his forces to encircle the airport. From sweltering submarines to dark radar bunkers to contested runways, the chain of command frequently pushed the world toward disaster. Each time it took an individual's personal courage to recognize the danger and say no. Today, the strategic landscape is far more difficult to control. The two-sided standoff of the 20th century has splintered into a multipolar competition. Rivalries between the US, China, and Russia are playing out through complex regional proxy wars and largely invisible cyber warfare. The largest conventional conflict in Europe since 1945 is the Russo-Ukrainian War. With at least 50 countries supplying military aid to Ukraine, it functions as a high-stakes proxy war between Russia and the NATO alliance. As Western nations slowly increase their involvement, allowing their weapons to strike targets inside Russia, the Kremlin continuously responds with nuclear blackmail, repeatedly warning that crossing these shifting boundaries will provoke a nuclear response. The complexity of modern alliances means localized strikes can trigger a global chain reaction almost immediately. In the 2026 Iran war scenario, strikes against leadership led to retaliatory attacks against U.S. bases and regional allies, quickly moving the conflict beyond a single border. This creates an international crisis the moment a stray missile or interceptor debris crosses into the territory of a treaty ally, like the debris that landed in Turkey during that scenario. A single mistake can force overlapping defense pacts into open warfare. The danger in these modern flashpoints is their sheer complexity. During the Cold War, the path to a nuclear exchange was linear and centralized. Today's battlefields are a chaotic web of state actors, proxies, and alliances, where a single miscalculation can spread outward in a dozen different directions at once. Going forward, the speed of conflict will only increase. Militaries are developing command structures that rely on autonomous artificial intelligence, hypersonic missiles that arrive in minutes, and instantaneous cyber attacks that cripple infrastructure before anyone realizes a war has started. When a cyber weapon strikes a power grid, or an algorithm recommends an immediate counterstrike, there is no time for human deliberation. Men like Vasily Arkhipov and Stanislav Petrov had minutes to analyze a situation, doubt their instruments, and make a conscious choice. By delegating nuclear and cyber responses to decentralized networks and rapid response algorithms, we are engineering the ultimate failsafe out of the process. When the doomsday systems of tomorrow malfunction, will there still be a human in the loop with the power and the courage to veto the apocalypse?